Go along. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We haven't got there yet, but I'll preempt Craig so he can take a minute to breathe. If you take a peek at your Zoom toolbar, you'll notice there's two buttons that you'll really want to pay attention to. One is the chat. It's already on fire. Thank you, everybody, for saying good morning. And the other one is a Q&A button. And with a topic like this, we're expecting a fair few questions, and we love them. Your questions really guide us. There is no script to, as you can tell, to what we talk about in the morning. So do put your questions in the Q&A. It's much easier for Craig to follow from there. And you also have the benefit, if you would like it, to keep your questions anonymous. Just make sure that you check that box if that's something that you want to do. But before we get started, as always, we'll just take a moment to recognize where we are. And I'm hoping that you can pause as well. It's going to be a big word today, pause. And just stop and recognize the land where you're situated. Sate is located on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kaurna, the Tsuut'ina, the Îyârhe of Nakoda, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Goodstoney. Traditionally, the city was known as McKintis, which is where the Bow River meets the Elbow River. We now obviously call it Calgary, also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. Thanks, Craig.
Perfect. Thank you, Jenny.
Welcome.
So, this session actually just about sold out our Zoom room. It's the first time we've come that close to having to turn people away, and so clearly it's an important topic. And it's funny, as we were chatting, beforehand, difficult conversations, I think, brings up a certain emotion, a certain feeling for everybody. You almost always know what they are just by that title. Maybe slightly different for some folks. Some folks may struggle with other conversations that others don't, right? Clearly a personal piece, but I wonder if just off the bat, calling them difficult conversations versus important conversations is something that we need to think about. And I think maybe, Jenny, I'm going to put you on the spot, and maybe we should just kind of pause and talk about what do we think a difficult conversation is. And folks, feel free to share your thoughts on that in the chat to help spur the thinking along here. But as I say, difficult conversation invokes something, a lot of interest, and I think we all kind of know what it is, but take it from there.
Okay. Well, I show up here to be put on the spot, so we're okay with that. I think that, okay, a couple of things. I agree with the important. I use the word vibrant a lot. There's an energy to a conversation that we find difficult, and even vibrant is a little bit less hairs up on the back of your neck than difficult. You and I share a good friend who call them spicy conversations. It's a matter of perspective. End of the day, as you said, they invoke something for us. And most times I think it's because they niggle at, they nudge, they slap you in the face with, we have this need to be liked. And for some of us, we're people pleasers. It's right there, it's in the front. Like, our aim is to please, not to disappoint or not to hurt. And for some of us, it's a little bit low. We'll say, oh, I'm not bothered. But actually, humans have a need for connection. We need to be liked. So it pushes at that. We have an absolute want usually to be in control. And one of the problems with a conversation is in the rhythm of a conversation, you're not always in control unless you're doing all the talking. And if you're doing all the talking, then that's not a conversation. Game over. And then the third one is that we really don't want to upset somebody else. And sometimes we lose track of that. I unfortunately do still hear people say, well, I'm just going to show them who's in charge, or I'm just going to tell them what's right. And that is never a healthy intent for a conversation. But for most people, we actually don't want to upset the person in front of us. And so maybe that's what makes it difficult, is we're fighting those inner urges. And to your point, we have a really important topic in front of us. And if we don't have that conversation, then there's an outcome and a consequence to that as well. And that's not always healthy either.
No, exactly. Just catching a few of the points in the chat here, I think that really hit on all the points around this topic. One, you anticipate it being an emotional
Yes.
conversation.
Yeah.
Two, it's a difficult conversation because, you might need to address inappropriate behavior, or you're sharing something that was not an anticipated outcome, either with
Mhm.
your team or your boss. It's a conversation that is not comfortable, right?
Yeah. There's a
Um,
big.
right? You don't want to upset who you're speaking with, but it may also be a difficult conversation, I'm going to add, because you're the one who's upset,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
thoughts on all of that, right? There's a bundle of things there that make these important conversations.
And I think the piece in here that we have to remember is, as you and I arrive at a conversation, we will always see things differently. So when they go into that vibrant mode or that difficult mode, it is usually because we're misaligned, and they become harder, potentially, the more right that we think we are. If we're upset, if we're like that emotional piece, anger is one that often shows up in the difficult conversations. And anger is a really curious sort of thing to work with because it's an incredibly passionate emotion. Like there's a lot of energy to anger. It's also a blanket emotion. So anger always covers an unmet need or an unmet want.
Hmm.
And it's a little backwards when you hear this for the first time, but anger is actually a gift because nobody gets angry for no reason. Like this doesn't happen for no reason. They get angry because they care about whatever it is that's made them angry, the unmet need or the unmet want. But one of the problems when difficult conversations get very emotional is our emotions are hugely contagious. And so if somebody is upset and comes in and just goes for it, and their voice is raised and that emotion is radiating from them, the chances are that you'll catch that, right? We're contagious up to about 10 feet. And so the minute that you catch that anger, your emotions are escalating as well. And now you're angry too. Well, there's no conversation going to come from two people who are chucking sentences at each other because they're angry. Whereas if we rewind it a little bit, you're angry. I don't want to wear that emotion. It's not mine to wear. It's not very comfortable, as you said. And I'm not
Yeah.
going to find anything out about what it is that's made you angry. And for most people still these days, what's made you angry? I'm probably not the cause. Right? It probably happened 3 steps ago. And this is where it's actually leaking out or erupting out, whatever that might be. So if I can not weigh your emotion, literally step back, you're not going to notice. And if you're in a meeting room, you can lean back. And if you can't lean back in your head, don't wear it. And then get curious because their perspective is different and something they care about, something that's got them to that point. But that's really hard if you're caught in the moment.
Yeah, incredibly so, right? And actually can't think of a time that's happened to me lately, but the ability, to your point, the ability to kind of hijack your own amygdala and pause and think about where, because that's just our natural reaction. If somebody comes at you hot, for most people, you're
Mhm.
immediately going to be on your toes, going to be defensive. Your
Mhm.
blood pressure is probably going to shoot up. Your pulse is going to start to race. And being able to slow down
Mhm.
and take a moment and dig into, okay, clearly, Jenny, I can see you're upset right now. Let's unpack this a bit, right? Or
Yeah.
tell me, like, 1,000 ways you could go at the start of that. Probably the worst one would be, Jenny, calm down.
You have
I'm
nobody
going
in the
to,
history of ever has calmed down from that. I think the amygdala is an important part here and the way for those of you who can see your screens, the way that we normally sort of talk about that is if you imagine your brain like a fist and your amygdala sits in the middle, that's your emotional piece. And your fingers here are the cortex, the sensible part of your brain, the logical part of your brain, the part of your brain that says, if you say this, you're going to ruin this relationship, for example. When the amygdala fires, and it always fires in protection, it kicks the cortex out of the way, right? So you're now missing your sensible brain. You can't talk logically and you can't think clearly. There's a huge chemical dump that's happening. But the catch-up time for your sensible, logical brain is just 6 seconds, right? The amygdala fires, you flip your lid if you like, and then there's just 6 seconds for that to catch up. And so actually, I put it in the applied strategies for today. I think Jefferson Fisher has summed this up beautifully. And his advice is make your breath your first word. So when somebody comes at you or drops something surprising at you, or there's that huge escalation of emotion, and we know when it happens, rather than diving into it, just stop and make your breath your first word. Two things happen. One, your system starts to calm down. So your fight, flight, or fright system slows down. You're in a much better place to make a response rather than a reaction. You still have all the emotions, but responding is far healthier than a reaction is. The other thing, and this is kind of
Yeah.
cool, is you on the other side, you think I'm thinking. You actually think I'm contemplating what you said. Most people who are in that emotional escalation want to be heard and understood. So if we're firing back and forth, I'm not listening to you. But if I just stop and make my first word just a breath, now I am potentially listening to you. And if I'm not, if I'm too busy bringing this down, I can say, okay, this is important. Tell me more, or tell me again so I get
Absolutely. Although Holly just asked an interesting question here is how do you take that breath without sounding like you're sighing or annoyed with that person? So
it.
you even have, you need to think about,
Yeah.
in that moment, you need to think about that breath because there is a difference between and, right?
I don't know if you did it intentionally. We're going to lose the eye roll because that's never going to help.
Well,
And
but that's my point. You can't, I don't know if you can sigh like that without the eye roll. But no, I didn't do it intentionally.
that's funny. No, practice. Okay, practice, practice, practice. And the practice is so to really sort of clear your brain. So when you when your amygdala hijacks you and your cortex is out of the way, you've got all these chemicals going on. The biggest one is cortisol, which is your stress hormone, and cortisol fogs your brain, so you can't think clearly. So the practice is a deep breath. Now that is the one that's going to sound like sighing. It's pretty noisy. You got to practice this at home. But if you practice that, you basically create a shortcut for yourself. But you can't leave here and just do it in the minute and expect it to work. It is a practice to bring that down to just simply a and if your eyes are expressive, then maybe don't look at the person. Like, we do not have to hold eye contact for the whole time.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or just look away.
Yeah. Well, maybe not quite like that.
Okay. So, clearly the emotional side of this and being able to, and hey, we say this, to Jenny's point, it takes practice.
Mhm.
This
Oh yeah.
isn't this, um, this isn't something that just you start saying, okay, I'm going to take a breath before I respond, and it happens immediately, right? These are things you need to think about practice. And so that brings me to, I kind of think about this in three sort of situations, Jenny, difficult or important conversations. Ones that you see that you need to have, quote unquote, in the moment, right?
Mhm.
Ones that you need to plan for, right? It's a conversation maybe that as a leader I've been putting off, or a conversation that I know I have to have with somebody that I'm going to schedule time for to have that conversation. And
Mhm.
I guess the caveat to the in the moment, I call it kind of the third option, but it's the I need to talk to you later comment. You know what I'm saying, right? You see something in the moment, maybe you don't want to address it then. And it's like, okay, we need to talk later. There's, I think there's responsibility on a leader, and maybe correct me if you think I'm wrong. I think there's a little responsibility here that if you're going to be gearing up for an important conversation, that you somewhat signal and prep the person for that. So lots there that I just threw at you, but dealer's
Mhm.
choice, take a pick and we can unpack them.
Let's do all of them. So, in fact, I looked up and Kerry's put in the chat later always gets a fear response. And it
Exactly.
does. The old for we need to talk, and then you've just ruined somebody's evening if it's not right there in that moment.
Exactly.
So that later piece, I think we need to avoid that. Either give the information or don't give the information. And so, I really like what you said in the plan for piece. One of the things with difficult conversations is we want to set aside real time. All right. It
Yeah.
might even mean scheduling it. So, if we're going to schedule it, are you available on Tuesday morning? I'd like to talk about X. Now we've got time for that. I've got a heads up as to what we're talking about. You've got a definite time when it's going to happen. Because what happens a lot of times for those of us who are avoidant to difficult conversations, oh, I'll have that tomorrow. I'll feel better tomorrow. I'll have my blood sugar in a better place. It'll just be better tomorrow. Rarely is the conversation going to be better. Right? Now you've just put in more, potentially, depending on your approach to these, more anxiety. You've ruined your evening as well. So, it brings us to your first one that you had. Can we have that conversation in the moment? So if we can't set time in like later in the week or later in the afternoon or whatever it is, can we make real time to have that conversation? And it might sound like, do you have the capacity right now to discuss the meeting this morning? Or do you have the bandwidth? I don't know what the right sort of word. It depends on your language. You've got to use what works for you. But at that point, if you are in a mad rush and under pressure and you say to me, Jenny, I've got no time today to even breathe, I know that we're not going to have real time for that conversation. So I like that piece of setting the
Yeah.
conversation up for success by making space for it.
Yeah, and Crystal put I think a really helpful thought in the chat here around, I understand we have to have this conversation, but I want to make sure we're both fully prepared to discuss this in a productive way. And so I think in that moment you can adjust it for that and just say, hey, Jenny, I think we need to have a chat about the meeting this morning, but maybe we need to both take a breath and come back to it in a productive way, right? Something like that. You can play, like there's good language there as opposed to saying, talk to me later, right? And to be clear, I don't think that's a good approach. I'm just saying we all know there's folks out there who have probably either done it or been on the receiving end of it. And all of a sudden, yeah, alarm bells are going off. You're wondering what's going on. Then you get to that meeting and it's like, oh, we needed to talk about something coming up that was not even an issue at all, right? So there could be so many ways that later, and I saw in the chat here, can be so triggering for folks.
Yes. And what you want to do is set the conversation up for success. In the meantime, you're setting you up for success and them up for success. And so,
Excellent.
it is how you frame it. It's your intention. And that really helps too, because if your intention is, I'm just going to show them the way it is, or I'm just going to tell them who's boss, as I mentioned before, that's not a great intention. Rewind. If your intention is to make something better or to help or to, any one of those avenues, that's a much better conversation. And that's something that somebody can easily buy into as well.
Absolutely. Jose puts an interesting question in here, though, and is what if there is no later? What if the issue has to be resolved now?
Then it has to be resolved now. It's what Marcus Buckingham would refer to as a priority interrupt. You're stopping everything to have that conversation.
Yeah.
And in some of the fields, like that conversation is difference between really it could be the difference between life and death. In some, in some of the technical out there in the field with the tools and everything else, that conversation is happening right now. So if it is a priority interrupt, where's your shortcut to get your sympathetic nervous system down to as balanced as it can be? And then, the usual sort of, I'm going to call them rules. Set the stage for yourself. Our go-to when something is wrong is to lean in and narrow in on the person. Worst case, that looks like blame and pointed fingers. And so if we take that breath, if we bring ourselves down, it allows us to open up just a little bit and take a look at this. What is their perspective? What are they seeing? There's that curiosity. And that conversation has begun at that point because you've given them control. And how they see it will be really different to how you see it. Okay, well, there's your conversation. Where have we got to get to in that?
Yeah. I just remember reading something about not Steve Jobs, Tim Cook. A common phrase that he uses in lots of these sorts of situations is the way I see it is, and then leans into his perspective, right? Because it sets that stage of this is what I'm seeing. That might not be what you were seeing, Jenny, to your point, right? You generally come in, I'm surprised the beach ball didn't come out, right? And that you were sharing that you come in with different perspective. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in reality, there's almost always three sides to any situation: yours, mine, and what actually is, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Um, building on the question that Jose had asked, somebody else has said, what if the other party is with higher authority and has no interest in the conversation to make things better?
Oof. Um, a couple of things here is with no interest is a perception. And
Yeah.
so if we're looking for that, we're going to find that. The other thing to maybe remember, one of the sort of rules of influence, I should have blown the beach ball up, it would have been really handy now. But if this is
Yeah.
me and this is the person who I
Go
think
ahead. We'll wait.
no, no. This is the person who I think has no interest. This person cares about different things than this person. And so often what we do is we come in with all our cares and worries
Yeah.
and why we need it and what's going on, and they are distracted by a completely different set that's here. And so one of the things that we can do to help it is get into there, get into over here. And it's usually a question that can lean into that. So if they seem like no interest, I might go with, you seem distracted. Would there be a better time to have this conversation? Or it doesn't feel to me this is important for you at the moment. Could I book time later in the week? It is important in
Yeah.
our team, field, world, wherever it is. It's a respectful call on what you're feeling. We are talking hierarchy, so we're talking tension. So you do want to be aware of the relationship at that point.
Yeah. And to your point, like without knowing specifics of that situation, we can say here's some general thinking around it. Clearly, you know your situation in your company and your relationships and how to leverage those or not, or what to be concerned of. And I think you also have to be prepared. To the both of those questions that you posed, Jenny, you may get a no. I don't
Yeah.
want to talk about it, and
Yeah.
then that tells you something as well, right?
And the
Doesn't tell
response
you a
there is
good
thank
thing.
you. Yeah. Yeah. The response is thank you. And really what the thank you is thank you for showing me who you are. But it's a thank you. And really if it is super important, back to the drawing board, right? There needs to be a different way to approach this. And we're into that conversation that you mentioned. We have to plan for that and figure out where that's sitting.
Yeah. Another question here, if says if it is an in the moment situation, can you say that you will debrief after and discuss? We would see this in healthcare where it is life or death or high stress situations.
Yes, you have to, by the sounds of things in there. And each context brings us a different set of situations. I think the important part is making sure that the conversation happens. And there's all those great examples of fighter pilots who debrief after a flight. I think they call them after action reviews. And
Yeah.
really, they're pretty intense when they happen because the feedback is real, but the feedback is going to make a difference in who comes back from the flight each time they go as they set themselves up for the next one. So yes, label it as it will be, and then make that conversation as healthy as possible when it happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Couple other questions here that have come in. I think it's going to go back to the whole conversation around emotions. Um, but asking this as in my office, we were recently told our work from home options are being taken away. This happened Tuesday, and emotions are very high and getting higher. It has been made clear this is quote unquote not up for discussion. So having a difficult conversation doesn't seem to be an option. How do we get through this emotional storm?
This is a popular conversation at the moment.
Yeah.
So when people are upset, the news isn't the way that they want it to be, then what they want most, and really we could take this as a general rule, right? The person in front of you wants to be seen, heard, and valued. And so if you're the person who you can't change the directive, there is no flexibility, we're really hoping those companies don't have one of their values as flexibility. Right? If you've got none of that, then for a patch of time, can you provide the empathy that people need? Hear them out. The boundaries are clear, right? You can't make changes to the decision that has been put there, but give people their chance to say why it's difficult, whatever those pieces are. But put a boundary on that too, because it'll get unproductive really quickly.
Yeah.
And if the black and white is there's no movement on this, then figure out a way to move forward with that and help people within that. Usually, when we hear things that we don't like, we run through a sort of a stack of emotions, if you like. The first three spell sad, shock, anger, and denial. And then, Craig, I'm keeping you busy in the chat here today. So the first three are sad, shock, anger, and denial. And then we have, what is it? Realization, rationalization, and action. And so it can take them a couple of days to get to action. And the action either is take care of what I need to, buckle down and get on with it in this case, or I have a really difficult choice to make and I choose to do this. But some
Yeah.
people need that time to speak and to get it out. So I think to answer the question in 2 words, patience and empathy. That would have been a
Yeah.
shorter version for you. Sorry.
That's okay. That's good. No, it's interesting because to your point, there seems to be more and more of that happening lately, and it's an emotionally charged situation. Like like, you're disrupting significant portions of people's lives with some of those decisions, and if it's not presented in a way that people at least understand why the decision is made, it makes it even worse, right? So, another question. I was recently, quote unquote, gang called by three members of another team and yelled at. It was completely inappropriate. I surprisingly remained calm throughout the conversation. Well done, I would say. I may have hung. But my question is, how do you come back from something like that? My trust in these people is completely broken, but I still have to work with them.
That is tough. Um, okay, the worst way that we can go is down the route of accusation, right? You yelled at me, your actions were inappropriate, etc., etc. What we want to do in that situation is switch the you back to an I because you're in control of yourself and you have control of those statements. So it might, coming back to what we said before, make real time for the conversation, book time with them. And you're gonna need to teach your Weetabix the morning of this one because it will require some preparation. I don't think there's space for niceties in these kind of conversations. That's just a filler and it does nothing for anybody's concentration, anxiety, or anything. So what's the clarity? And the clarity is I'm not prepared to have conversations where the tone is whatever it might have been, or I'm not prepared to have a conversation with three people raising their voices at me. I am prepared to have a conversation that is adult to adult and deals with the difficult tasks in front of us.
Yeah.
Set your
Well,
boundaries. Yes, tough.
well done. I have to say, I was searching my head for how I might respond to that, and that was way better than what I came up with. I will tell you that. So, um, what are your suggestions when you see a senior leader being avoidant on having a difficult conversation with their direct reports because of the reaction they are going to get? They step over it, they walk over key issues, which impacts trust, collaboration, and teamwork. How do you have the difficult conversation with senior management, telling them that because they are avoiding their own difficult conversations?
Funny how they're human too. And there's a lot of, I think that's the thing with this, is a lot of human. And so if it's your job to have the conversation with them, I think again, it's just leaning into what's the what is the situation that we need to discuss. And if you know it's because of reaction, then whose reaction is it? And can you help them with success for what's happening in that reaction? Like we can't control what anybody else does. And sometimes part of empathy, right? Remember, we just ran through them: shock, anger, denial, whatever that part might be, defensiveness. A lot of defensiveness comes from the language that we use. So, help with language could be a part in there. But it's just
Hmm.
remembering that that's their emotion, let them have that. And sometimes they need some space for that. And my response to that when somebody does fire is, this is obviously a really important conversation for you. What else do you need me to know? Um, I don't feel I've actually answered the question there, but I think if you sit under them, is it your job to have that conversation? Can you help that conversation?
Yeah, it's sorry, I'm just we are getting inundated with questions now. We seems to be the halfway mark where we usually get here. Um, yeah. So another question here. We recently underwent a reorganization, and a manager who was formerly at the same level of me was moved to being my direct report. We
Mm.
were friends, but I can feel the energy shift, and there's a feeling of resentment. What do you suggest as an approach to change? I discussed the change moving forward and how they may be feeling.
That is what we call a difficult conversation, and
Yep.
everything that we've said
And an
so far.
important one.
So yeah, and it's your job to have a one-on-one with that person. One-on-ones, and we talked about this a couple of conversations ago. One-on-ones are such a good tool to use. And again, the person in front of you wants to be seen, heard, and valued. And that conversation might start with, this may not be fun for both of us. Or this might be a difficult one, Brené Brown's term, for us to rumble through. But I really want to get to the point where we can work effectively together and keep our relationship intact. And we know that that relationship changes when with those leadership tensions potentially, but you do want to be able to work together effectively. And then dial up your curiosity. And there's so many different ways that you can go with that. But the voice share in that conversation really wants to be less from the leader and more from the person that they're talking to.
Yeah, it's a challenging one. And I, I think to your couple of your earlier points, one, people need time to work through that change, right? So if
Yeah.
whoever you've been promoted over, who's been reorged under you, they need to have time to process that. They may take longer than you with it. Um, but the other side is too, you can't control their reaction.
No.
And so I think, you have to do your best to, try and have that conversation and share your thoughts and share your feelings. It's happened to me twice. It's not humble bragging, but I've been promoted twice over past colleagues.
Yeah.
Um, and had sat down and had the conversation with both of them, and it all worked out in those moments. But there may be times it doesn't. Like, not everything's going to work out perfectly, unfortunately, right?
No, I think the other piece too is like that's not the only conversation. And so if you have that
No.
conversation in X amount of time, and this can be part of it, let's follow up in a couple of weeks, in a couple of months, or maybe it's just if you are working face to face, how's this going? Right? How is this working for you? Only ask the question though if you want the answer to it. Because if you don't want the answer,
Yeah,
then
that's a really good point.
yeah.
No, exactly. Um, we have 5 questions left in the queue, and I don't know if we're gonna have enough time to get through them all, Jenny, but we're going to give it a go. So, I'm supporting two individuals who get along like oil and water on a good day, and most of their interactions have a tone of negatively charged, difficult conversation. They need to be able to collaborate, but there is a defined hierarchy of decision making in the project. How can I help guide the interactions to be more productive and less difficult off the starting block?
That's it. Yeah, that's tricky. In psychological safety, we talk about how will you set the stage? And the other phrase that I like that goes with that is you get what you tolerate. So as a leader, be really careful of what you are rewarding and what you're tolerating. And as you set the stage for conversations like that, what we want to promote is intellectual friction and not social friction. So if you hear the comments are getting personal, step in. And it might be as simple as, I'm going to suggest that we take a time out in this conversation. we seem to have shifted away from the task at hand. Another example of how you set the stage there might be, observe, don't interpret. What I notice, what I see, what I know. Remember, see, we've come back to the I. There's a sort of control in that. Whereas if you're doing this and you do that, that's an accusatory piece. I've seen people in their meetings actually ban words from meetings. So you can ban the words you and but and all that, whatever the negative ones are. It just depends on the relationship between the team as well. There may be space to have conversation with both of them in the room and dig deeper. That's a real context piece. It's hard for us to say here on that.
Yeah. Sorry, I just want to make sure I got that. You said support intellectual friction and not emotional friction. Is that how you
So
word it?
intellectual friction and not social friction. Social is where it gets,
Social.
yeah.
Perfect. So I'm going to try and we've got more questions rolling in, but there's a piece of this I think somewhat tied to the questions that we haven't really touched on yet, and that is, that planned conversation or the conversation as a leader, you should plan, but you're avoiding, and you're avoiding, and you're delaying having it because maybe it'll resolve itself. I think,
Optimistic.
yeah, no, very true, but the point being is that avoidance, that delay, that hope, which we know is not a strategy, I think can often probably preempt and offset a lot of the questions and end up coming down the line because you've left it that long. So just your thoughts around, why do we delay these conversations as leaders?
Mm.
And how do we get better at being proactive? Like what's the kick in the pants that we need to have the important conversations?
So I think we delay them because we like to be comfortable, and difficult conversations are often uncomfortable. Comes back to where we started this morning. We want people to like us. We don't want to hurt people. We don't like that discomfort. And the key thing to remember is that uncomfortable piece might last for a very small stretch of time compared to the positive outcome, the deeper relationship, the more valuable connections that we make if we do have the conversation. We can all skirt around the top and be nice, but we can't get real work done if we're not having these conversations. And I caught very briefly that somebody had mentioned Simon Sinek's video. He has one out there on YouTube that talks about the FBI approach to a conversation. So how do you feel? What's the behavior that you're talking about? And what's the impact of that behavior? Feelings, behavior, impact.
Mm,
So if you need to plan it, like have that ready. Okay, I am frustrated, this behavior is leading to this, whatever that might be. And I think the important thing to remember here too
yeah,
is clarity is essential. And clarity helps. When our anxiety goes up, we use more words, we skirt around it, and often we don't deal with the actual issue that we wanted to talk about. So as you're planning, as you're thinking about it, narrow your focus, right? Can you get it into one or two sentences? And remember to, that's coming from your perspective. So it is a conversation. How do they see it? What is their take on it? What is their
yeah,
version of it? And be
yeah.
prepared to
I think
stop.
exactly. I think for me, at least one thing I've found really helpful on this is plan your opening,
Yeah.
right? When it's time to actually have the conversation, rehearse those one or two sentences that you want to use to start the conversation. Because
Mhm.
to your point, if you kind of are in this mushy middle and kind of sort of lean into and wade into the conversation, but not really, get it out, state it. 9 times out of 10, in my experience, the conversation starts to flow in a reasonable manner, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, One last question here that I'm going to go to because I think it kind of um, wraps things up before we wrap things up. But after a difficult conversation or an important conversation, how do you support a positive working environment? I'm going to say regardless of how the outcome of that conversation went, because you could have a range of outcomes. The question was saying if the conversation didn't go as planned, but I think there's both sides of that.
I think the follow-up conversation is important. We've mentioned that already, but I also think how you, especially if you're the leader, how you model after that conversation is crucial too. So it's very possible you're going to need some time for yourself. Take that, right? Close the door. It is okay to close the door for a little while. And
Yeah.
emotions do this as well. The one thing I'd watch for is if it keeps resurfacing, it's not dealt with. You might think it's dealt with, they obviously don't if it keeps coming back up. So that's where that
Yeah.
check back in becomes important within there. And if you've built your social capital, you know each other beyond just your title, there's so much more to talk about than just that conversation that you just had. And so it's much easier
Yeah.
to lean into that person and the value that they bring, seen, heard, and valued.
Yeah. No, and that last point, I think, it's not that you're looking to quote unquote return to normal after having a difficult conversation or important one, because clearly that conversation is establishing a bit of a, here's a phrase we haven't used in a while, folks, new normal,
Right.
after we used pivot for so many years and then new normal. But, I think the challenge there is to just not make it weird,
Mhm.
right? How do you how do you have that important conversation and then move forward like adults and carry on? So,
The other thing,
but speaking of carrying on, oh, sorry, Jenny, I was going to say,
just one
speaking
more.
of carrying on,
I know.
okay, and then
I
and
really did
then and then
transition
you can go
already.
right into the wrap up.
All right, I can do that. But the piece I think that's relevant here, we seem to be saying this all the time, but come back to that ratio, right? 5 to 1, catch people getting it right as well. If you're always looking for what's wrong, you will find it. If you're looking for what's right, you will find it. And so
100.
that might be a part that helps get that traction back on the other side as well. This is the 1. And if you've been doing the 5 as well, it actually reduces the difficulty of the conversation too. And
Yeah,
now I will take
absolutely.
us right in. So, just in case anybody is brand new here today, we always finish with one big idea, 2 things that you can do straight away, and 3 questions at the end. So, our big idea to finish with, there's lots of words up on the screen there. But these conversations are what we need in order to build relationship and build connection. We build trust when we dig in and when we have them. So the worst thing I think we can do is to avoid the conversation completely. Couple of strategies that you can take away. We talked about this one a lot. Pause before you respond. So make your first word your breath. There's Jefferson Fisher's sentence. This allows you to just bring your emotions down and will help you to speak with clarity too. The second one to take away is the idea of listening generously. Remember, this kind of friction, those passionate emotions, they don't happen because people don't care. They happen because people do care. Their emotional regulation is probably out, and you don't have to wear that emotion. I should say here too, do not put yourself in situations of harm, right? If it's going to be a harmful situation, leave. But where you can, lean in, engage with curiosity, find out what's going on for them. Those passionate emotions are blanket emotions, unmet needs and unmet wants. Usually we promise 3 questions. Last time I did have 3 questions. I went for more than 3 this time. So there's 5. Craig will have counted the question marks already. There's probably more than 5 question marks on there. But here are the questions that, maybe one of them will nudge you to think about the conversation that you need to have or how you show up in those conversations. Your control sits simply with you. And that is a really good place to start here. And there we are. We're on the last one. Thanks, Craig. Craig, you're just on mute. I'm not sure if you know that.
So there we go. I now know that. I think the Rogers Gremlins got me here, Jenny. I actually disappeared for a moment
I did
and
see.
nobody noticed. That's okay. It's just like home. Anyway, thank you. And folks, thanks for joining us. We are back Friday, May 2nd to talk about leadership blind spots. Looking forward to this conversation. As always, appreciate everything that you shared in the chat. You will get a link to the recording following this. It might come out a little later than usual next week, given that we're heading into what is a 4-day weekend at SAIT. And with that in mind, have yourselves a wonderful Easter if you celebrate. And Jenny, thank you. Appreciate you. Everybody, take care. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Craig. Have a good weekend.